Hi everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into one of the most painful twists so far. In the middle of a police investigation, James's powerful father looks him in the eye and says, "You are not my son." And for the first time, that might actually be true. As James's whole identity shatters, will losing his father's name finally set him free, or destroy him completely? If this story grips you, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. You are not my son. The words hit harder than any punch James had ever taken. They echoed off the white walls of the conference room at the police station, bouncing between the glass windows and the stack of documents on the table. For a heartbeat, even the ceiling fan seemed to pause. Across from him, his father stood in a crisp shirt that didn't quite hide the tension in his shoulders. Two investigators, Huang, and a recording device sat between them. Outside the door, Diep paced the hallway with Nai, trying to keep her calm with soft jokes and a paper cup of water. James stared at his father. "What did you just say?" Mr. Than didn't look at him. He spoke to the investigator instead, as if James were already written out of the room. "I want it on record," he said coldly, "that this young man does not represent my family. He made his own choices. He walked out. He is not my son in any meaningful sense." "That's not what you said on the phone," Huang cut in smoothly. "We all heard you call him son when you were negotiating with a kidnapped child on the line." A flicker of annoyance passed over his face. "That was an emotional moment," he said. "I was trying to de-escalate. But legally, biologically, morally..." He glanced at James now, eyes like polished stone. "I owe him nothing." The investigator frowned. "Biologically?" he asked. "Are you stating he is not your biological child?" Silence. Something cold slid down James's spine. Mr. Than seemed to realize he'd gone a step too far. He smoothed his tone. "I'm saying," he amended, "that I refuse to let my life's work be smeared by a boy who has turned his back on everything I gave him. Whether we share blood or not is irrelevant." But the word was already out there. Biologically. Huang's gaze sharpened. "For the record," she said, "do you deny arranging for Diep's brother to remove the child from school?" "I deny any involvement in that overreaction," he answered. "If her brother misunderstood my concern for my grandson's welfare..." "Grandson?" Huang pounced. "I thought you owed no one anything." His jaw tightened. "Don't play word games with me," he snapped. "I agreed to help with the girl because I believed she was being dragged into a dangerous situation. That mistake will not be repeated." James's hands trembled under the table. He curled them into fists in his lap, nails biting his palms. "Dangerous," he repeated. "You mean a life where you can't control everyone with money?" His father ignored him. "Are we done?" he asked the investigator. "I have a company to run." "For now," the man replied. "But we may recall you as the investigation continues, especially once we have Mr. Lai's full statement on record." "You're wasting your time," Mr. Than said. "This is a family matter dressed up as a criminal case by a very creative woman with a niche for drama." Huang smiled thinly. "If you're so sure, you shouldn't be worried about what your former assistant has to say," she remarked. For the first time, real surprise flashed in his eyes. "Lan?" The investigator closed his notebook. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Than. We'll be in touch." When his father swept out, the air felt suddenly thinner, like a storm had just passed and left everything rattling. James stayed seated. "Hey," Huang said gently. "Breathe." He realized he'd been holding his breath and let it out in a shaky exhale. "Did you hear him?" he whispered. Biologically, like he just threw that word like a stone and walked away. "I heard," she said. "And so did the recorder. It may not mean anything. It may mean everything. Either way, he weaponized it to hurt you in front of witnesses. That's who he is." James nodded, but his mind had already gone somewhere else. Backward. To his childhood. To the way his father had praised his grades, but never said, "You're just like me." To the times he'd heard relatives joke that he didn't look like a Thon. To his mother's face that one time, when he was 12 and asked why his blood type didn't match the chart in his science textbook. "James," Huang said softly. He blinked back to the present. "I need to see my mother," he said. "Now." The hospital room smelled faintly of disinfectant and boiled vegetables. His mother looked smaller against the pillows, but her eyes were clear. She smiled when she saw him, then frowned when she saw his face. "What did he say to you?" she asked immediately. "You look like you swallowed a stone." He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, elbows on his knees, fingers interlaced. For a moment, he couldn't find his voice. "Ma," he finally managed, reverting to the word he'd used as a boy. "I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. No protecting feelings. No for your own good." Her expression shifted. "This is about your father," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "He told the investigators I'm not his son, that biologically he owes me nothing." His mouth twisted. "At first I thought it was just cruelty. Then I remembered some things. The way people would say I took after you. The way he never once said I had his eyes." Her hands tightened on the sheet. "He said that? In front of them?" James nodded. "Was he lying to hurt me?" he asked. "Or telling the truth to free himself?" She looked down at her hands. "Some truths," she said slowly, "were supposed to go with me to the grave." Anger flared. "Whose decision was that? His? Yours? Did either of you ever think I deserved a say?" A tear slipped down her cheek. "You are my son," she whispered. "That's not what I asked," he said, voice breaking. "Am I his?" For a long time, the only sound was the beeping of her monitor and the soft whoosh of air from the vent. "When I was younger," she began, staring at some point beyond the wall. "Before your father became who he is now, he was different. Still ambitious, but softer, less sharp. We married young, we struggled. He worked too much. I was lonely." James swallowed. He knew where stories like this went. He also knew that knowing didn't make hearing it easier. "There was a friend," she continued, "an old classmate. He'd help with errands when your father was away on trips, fix things, carry heavy bags. Listen, your father knew him, trusted him. One night, I was weak, foolish, human." Her voice shook. "I regretted it immediately. I thought it was just a moment that would fade." "But it didn't," James said quietly. She shook her head. "A few months later, I found out I was pregnant. Your father was thrilled. He said the timing was perfect, that a son would motivate him to expand the business. I wanted to tell him the truth. I almost did. But every time I opened my mouth, I saw our tiny apartment, his tired face, the bills stacked on the table, and I stayed silent." James felt like the floor had tilted, like he might slide right off the earth. "Does he know?" he asked. "Not because of me," she said. "When you were born, he claimed you completely. He held you like you were a trophy and a miracle. I told myself biology didn't matter. That love was stronger than blood." She gave a bitter little laugh. In some ways, I was right. In others, James finished. He used the doubt as another tool. I don't know when he started to suspect, she admitted. Maybe it was the blood type, like you. Maybe it was something in your face he couldn't see himself in. Maybe it was just his nature, always looking for betrayal. A few years ago, during a bad argument, he hissed, "You think I don't know that boy might not even be mine?" I begged him to stop. He never brought it up again. I thought it was just venom. I wanted to believe it was. "And you never told me," James said, anger and hurt mixing until he couldn't tell them apart. "I wanted you to feel chosen," she whispered. "Not accidental, not something to be argued over across a desk. Your whole life he claimed you publicly, privately, financially. I thought, whatever the blood said, you were his in every way that mattered." He let out a harsh breath. "Tell that to the man who just told the police I'm nothing to him." Her eyes filled. "He is trying to cut you loose," she said. "So when you drag him into the light, he can say, 'He was never really mine.' It doesn't erase what he did. It doesn't erase the years he called you son when it was convenient." James leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The tiles blurred. "So, what does it make me?" he asked, half to himself. "A stranger invading his empire? A mistake from a moment of weakness? An outsider who dared to love a woman he couldn't control?" "It makes you James," his mother said firmly. "The boy who carried groceries without being asked, who saved his allowance to buy his sister a used bicycle, who stood up to his father even when it meant losing everything. Blood did not make you that way. Choices did." He swallowed hard. "Do you know who my biological father is?" The words felt awkward, like they belonged in someone else's mouth. She closed her eyes. "He died years ago," she said, "before your father ever threw the word biological at a judge. He was not a better man, just a different one. Don't romanticize what you lost. Focus on what you are." A strange mixture of relief and grief washed through him. No mysterious man to confront, no new family to unearth, just a ghost and a whole lot of questions. "Will you hate me now?" she asked softly, "for not telling you?" He looked at the woman who had bandaged his knees, stayed up with his fevers, hidden burnt rice from his father's anger. The woman whose heart had just been cut open and sewn back together by strangers, while his father used that fact as a chess move. "I'm angry," he said honestly. "Very. It will take time." He reached for her hand. "But I don't hate you. I hate that he turned something as human as a mistake into a weapon." She squeezed his fingers, tears spilling over. "I'm so sorry." He let his head drop for a moment, then straightened. "Does Diep know any of this?" he asked. "No," she said. "I never told her. She only knows he's cruel." He huffed out a humorless laugh. "She was right on that one." He stood, kissed his mother's forehead, and walked out into the hallway, where Diep was sitting on a plastic chair, Nye asleep in her lap. One look at his face, and she knew. "What did he do?" she asked. "What did he say now?" James sank into the chair beside her, staring at his hands. "He said I'm not his son," he replied quietly. "And for once, he might not be lying." Diep's eyes widened. Before she could respond, Nye stirred, blinking up at both of them. "Are we okay?" she mumbled sleepily. James looked at her, at Diep, at the stretch of hallway that suddenly felt like the fragile bridge between the family he'd thought he had and the one sitting right in front of him. "We're figuring it out," he said softly. But inside, questions were already forming, pressing, demanding. If he wasn't his father's son by blood, what did that do to everything they'd been fighting? Did it free him, or make the battle even more complicated? And if his entire identity had been built on a name that might no longer belong to him, who was James without Thon? He didn't know. Not yet. But he knew he was about to find out. James stepped out into the hallway like someone had pulled the floor half a meter lower without warning. The white neon lights hummed overhead. Nurses passed. A cart rattled by. Life went on, clinically indifferent. On the cracked plastic chair, Diep sat with knee curled against her, the little girl's head heavy on her lap, one hand still clutching the corner of James's old t-shirt like a security blanket. Diep took one look at his face and stopped breathing for a second. "What did he do?" she whispered. "What did he say now?" James lowered himself into the chair beside her, elbows on his knees, fingers laced so tightly they hurt. "He told them I'm not his son," he said. And for once, he wasn't just being cruel. My mother, she confirmed it. The words hung between them like a crack in glass. Diep's mouth parted, but no sound came out. This wasn't another insult thrown in anger. This was years being torn up by the roots. So all this time, she began, then stopped, because there was no sentence big enough. "All this time," James said hoarsely, "I was fighting to be seen by a man who was already half convinced I didn't belong to him. All this time, every my son came with a question mark he never let me see." He let out a shaky laugh that wasn't laughter. "And now, when it might cost him something, he throws the question mark at me like an answer." Diep's chest ached. "James, I don't know what hurts more," he went on, staring at the opposite wall. "That he might be right about the blood, or that he used it like this, like a stain he can suddenly wash his hands of. Not my son, not my mess." He swallowed hard. "What does that make my entire life? A long mistake?" Knee shifted, half asleep, mumbling, "Uncle James, don't be sad." Then sinking back into dreams, unaware that the man she was clinging to had just had the ground cut from under him. Diep brushed a strand of hair from the child's forehead, her own hands trembling. "You are not a mistake," she said firmly. "You never were. Not when you carried groceries for your mother. Not when you defended me. Not now. His blood doesn't get to erase your goodness." James shut his eyes, as if her words hurt and healed in the same breath. "If I'm not his son," he said quietly, "what have I been breaking myself for all these years? What did I lose you for before? What did I give up, bend for, swallow for a man who now gets to shrug and say, 'He was never really mine'?" There it was, the raw nerve exposed. Diep reached for his hand. He didn't pull away, but there was a flinch, small and unintentional, like touch might make everything spill over. "You still carry his name," she said softly. "His contracts, his threats, his crimes. The world doesn't let you put it all down just because he said one sentence in a cold room." He let out a breath that sounded like it scraped his lungs on the way out. "So I get the worst of both," he murmured. "Not enough of him to be loved. Just enough of him stuck to me to be blamed." Silence wrapped around them. Monitors beeped behind the door. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed too loudly at something on their phone. Life, again, shamelessly ordinary, while his own had just cracked. "Do you hate her?" Diep asked quietly after a long time. "Your mother, for not telling you." James stared at his hands. "Right now," he admitted, I don't even know who to aim it at. Him for using it, her for hiding it, myself for needing any of them. He turned his head, finally meeting her eyes. And you, he added softly, for being the only part that feels real, and therefore the part that hurts the most to lean on. Her throat tightened. What do you mean? If he's not my father, James said, voice almost a whisper, then this whole war is me choosing you, completely, with nothing to fall back on. No name, no inheritance, no, at least he's still my dad in the background. Just you, just us, and a man on the other side who can now say, why are you still fighting me? We're not even blood. Tears burned behind Diep's eyes. She wanted to tell him it didn't matter. That love was enough. That the home they were building in this messy, cramped life could replace the palace he'd just been kicked out of. But the words stuck. Because love didn't pay hospital bills. Love didn't erase contracts. Love didn't magically turn a man's identity crisis into a clean new page. We'll figure it out, she said instead. It sounded thin even to her. James nodded slowly, like someone agreeing to climb a mountain with a broken ankle because there was no other path home. Who am I? He asked, half to himself. If I'm not Thon's son? If you let him define that, Diep said, squeezing his hand, then he still owns you, even without the blood, even without the name. He looked at their joined hands, hers small and flower-roughened, his larger, still faintly bruised. And if I don't? He asked. Then you have to do the hardest thing, she whispered. Build yourself from the inside out, without a father's approval, without his name as a shield, without knowing where you came from, only knowing who you refuse to become. Nye snuggled closer in her sleep, arm flopping over both their wrists, bridging them. James stared at that tiny arm, at the weight of it, at the warmth. Right now, he said, voice low and cracked. All I know is that the man who raised me just broke something I can never glue back together. And I have no idea yet if losing him this completely will save me in the long run or destroy me. Diep didn't have an answer. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the three of them pressed together on a hard plastic chair in a too-bright hallway, balanced on the thin, painful edge between past and future. Behind one door, his mother's heart monitor kept beeping, a steady, stubborn rhythm. Somewhere across the city, the man who had just disowned him by a single sentence was already figuring out how to use that same sentence to wash his hands of everything they were about to expose. Was this the moment James finally became free? Or the moment he'd realized that walking away from a father who never fully claimed him would cost more than he was ready to pay? For now, all he had was a new, burning emptiness where Son used to sit. A woman who refused to let go of his hand. A child who still called him uncle, like it was the safest word in the world. And a question with no quick answer tearing quietly through his chest. In the police station, during questioning about Nye's kidnapping, James's father suddenly snaps, "You are not my son," trying to distance himself from the case. At first it feels like pure cruelty, but when James confronts his mother in the hospital, she breaks down and admits a long-buried truth. Years ago, in a moment of loneliness, she was unfaithful. James may not be his father's biological child, though his father claimed and used him his entire life. Now James is ripped in two. The man he's been fighting is possibly not his real father, yet still shapes his whole past, name, and pain. He feels like he's getting the worst of both worlds, never fully loved, but still carrying all the blame. Sitting in the hallway with Laitu, Diep, and Nye, he's left asking, who is he, if he's not Than's son anymore?